All right, so we're in Revelation 8 and 9 today. We're going to be picking up at Revelation chapter 8, verse 10. And we're going to be looking at the last of the, well, not the last. We're not actually going to get through all of them, the majority of the trumpet judgments. So we're going to look at some more of those trumpet judgments. So I want to say, I know that this isn't a lot of fun stuff. I think some people take enjoyment in the speculation of how these judgments are going to play out. For example, you can debate all day long about, is the water going to literally be turned into blood or something like blood? And so it can be fascinating to talk about these topics, but I do think that this should be difficult for people to read and go through, looking at what God is going to do to his creation. Seeing these destructive judgments that the likes have never been before seen on earth. And I just always want to remind everybody that this isn't intended to be enjoyable. It's not intended to be easy to digest, but this is the judgment of God on the world. So we should always shudder as we look at this and thank the Lord that because of Christ, we have been delivered from his judgment and his wrath. We're going to start today looking at the third of the trumpet judgments, but before we cover that one, let's get a brief reminder of the first two trumpet judgments, which happened right before this. God threw hail and then something like a mountain down upon the ocean. And so we have these numerous objects falling upon the earth. And the result of the first two judgments is that 1/3 of the earth's croplands are burned up and destroyed. Then you have 1/3 of the earth's ocean waters, probably bays, gulfs, that are turned into blood. And the result of that is 1/3 of the shipping vessels on earth are destroyed. So this is just absolutely devastating, just those two alone. We could have stopped there, and that probably would be enough for us. But we continue down the road of judgment and the subject of God ruining the world's freshwater supply in verses 10 and 11. The third angel sounded, and a great star fell from heaven, burning like a torch. And it fell on 1/3 of the rivers and on the springs of waters. The name of the star is called Wormwood, and 1/3 of the waters became wormwood. And many men died from the waters because they were made bitter. So this is one of the judgments of the trumpets that does not actually have a parallel with the judgments upon Egypt. The second judgment turned the seas into blood, which obviously parallels with the Nile River being turned into blood. The third one relates to all the freshwater sources in the midst of the land becoming undrinkable. So a meteor of some sort falls upon the earth, and the result of that meteor falling upon the earth is that it makes 1/3 of the fresh water on earth bitter. Now, some point to maybe this making the 1/3 of the fresh water poisonous or deadly, but I think that seems to be reading too much into what's written here. It appears to be that it is a taste that is so bitter that the water just becomes undrinkable. It says that the water is likened to wormwood, and this is the only instance of wormwood in the Bible, but wormwood is actually a plant in the ancient Near East, and the wormwood plant is proverbial for its vile taste. It's a plant that is so disgusting, you can't eat it. So based upon the language, this is just water that just tastes so disgusting that you can't get it down. And if all of a sudden you lose 1/3 of the water as becoming undrinkable, a lot of people are going to die from thirst as a result of that. So I don't think it is the water that directly kills people, but it is the lack of drinkable water that many die as a result of. And I'm sure there's some people who would probably read that and say, well, don't we have wonderful water purification today? But I'm going to guess that if all of a sudden you had a one world government that was trying to govern the entire world and all the utilities around the world, and then a catastrophe happened that all of a sudden made 1/3 of the fresh water on the earth undrinkable, they are going to have an impossible time trying to manage that water and to be able to make it drinkable for people to be able to consume. And so I don't think our purification efforts are going to be able to keep up with what happens in this judgment. I think we know how it is living in the New Orleans area. What happens after a storm and all of a sudden our water, gets knocked out and we can't drink from it, how difficult it is sometimes to find that drinking water that you need. And we know hurricanes are going to happen, so we should be ready for all that stuff. And we still have a hard time getting all that drinkable water on our hands. So I don't think any public works department is going to be prepared for what happens in this judgment, and many people will die as a result. And then that brings us to the fourth angel and the fourth trumpet in Revelation 8:12. The fourth angel sounded, and a third of the sun and a third of the moon and a third of the stars were struck, so that a third of them would be darkened, and the day would not shine for a third of it, and the night in the same way. So once you get into what John is saying in verse 12, to me, this is one judgment that I really see as John saying, I'm seeing something about the earth getting dark, and I'm just not sure how to put it into words, because this is kind of confusing what he says happens here. And I think it's confusing probably because John's seeing something and he just doesn't know how to describe it. Again, we see this tied, though, to one of the plagues in Egypt. The ninth plague was the plague of darkness. There are a couple of things that make us say that John just doesn't know what he's seeing. First, he says the sun, moon, and stars were struck. I mean, what does that even mean? Like how could that even happen? The sun, the moon, and the stars getting struck. What is striking them? What does that even mean? Like, I can't even imagine what that might possibly look like, or even what that could possibly be. And then notice that it's not just a third of the stars, but this is including the sun and the moon. So just kind of an odd thing. And then the result of that is that a third of them are struck. And it says that there is no light for a third of the day and a third of the night. And at first, the way it's written, it sounds as if what's happening is the amount of light that we have in the earth is decreased by a third. So it's almost like we're stuck in this kind of dreary, eerie setting. But then at the end, it makes it sound like a third of the time period is absolutely blackness. That it doesn't shine at all for a third of the day. It doesn't shine at all for a third of the night. So it's like, are we having a third less light, or are we having a third of the time with no light at all? Because it seems like John is saying both of those in these same verses, which is why I say John's trying to describe something that he's never seen before. None of us have seen before. He doesn't really know how to describe it, but we're just simply saying that there is a darkness during this time period. And I'm going to say that this darkness, probably the greatest impact of this would be fear and terror. Fear over all the stuff that's happened before. Now the world becomes dark, and probably a lot of people thinking, well, then what's going to come next? And so there's this fear, this foreboding as a result of this. So I see the plague of darkness as a fear of probably a mental anguish, mental terror upon people, not only thinking of what's come before, but I'm sure at this point, they got to be thinking, what's going to come again? If you remember, in the midst of the pandemic, one of the things where people were always talking about, oh no, what's going to come upon us next? And so as soon as there were news that there were murder hornets in the United States, people were like, oh no, we're going to have these crazy murder hornets everywhere, where if we weren't in the midst of the pandemic and that news happened, probably nobody would have given it a second thought. But we were just looking for what was the next devastation that come. And I would imagine that this darkness will have the same effect. And then we kind of see this sense of foreboding in heaven as well as on earth in verse 13. Then I looked, and I heard an eagle flying in mid-heaven, saying with a loud voice, woe, woe, woe to those who dwell on the earth, because of the remaining blasts of the trumpets and of the three angels who are about to sound. So probably the most interesting part of this verse when it comes to issues of Bible trivia is who is delivering this woe. Is it an angel, or is it a bird. There are a few manuscripts that say that this is an angel who delivered these woes, but the date of those manuscripts that say angel, I think the earliest one is around 900. So none of the earlier manuscripts say angel at all. And so I think a lot of times, whenever I can get a majority manuscript that dates back to an earlier time period, I always end up going with the majority. But this is one where there's none of the angel readings from an earlier time period. So most likely we should be seeing this as a bird. But they didn't have precise titles for animals back in that day as we do in this day. So this is more of a generic term for a bird of prey and not necessarily an eagle. It's not a precise word for eagle. So then the question is, what kind of bird is it? The two most common birds that are most likely is that it is an eagle or a vulture. I'm going to prefer that this is a vulture saying these woes, because if you look at what's going on in this time period, all the people who are dying, what's going to come up afterwards, I think a vulture would probably be much more picturesque of the woes that's taking place than an eagle. So then in my mind, when I read this verse, I picture a vulture flying above heaven and saying the woes for the death that's going to take place upon the earth, a vulture getting ready to devour those who fall as a result of the last trumpet blast. So we have this three-part woe expression and devastation and sorrow that will come thereafter, and it will come on the earth, just like with the seal judgment. So what the vulture is woeing here is that God from heaven is going to bring judgment that's going to be afflicted upon the earth. And without further delay, let's see this next woe and judgment in the fifth trumpet. And I think the description of the fifth trumpet can be broken into two sections, and we're going to look at the first section in verses 1 through 6 of Revelation 9. Then the fifth angel sounded, and I saw a star from heaven, which had fallen to the earth. And the key to the bottomless pit was given to him. He opened the bottomless pit, and smoke went up out of the pit, like the smoke out of a great furnace. And the sun and the air were darkened by the smoke of the pit. Then out of the smoke came locusts upon the earth, and power was given them as the scorpions of the earth have power. They were told not to hurt the grass of the earth, nor any green thing, nor any tree, but only the men who do not have the seal of God on their foreheads. They were not permitted to kill anyone, but to torment for 5 months. And their torment was like the torment of a scorpion when it stings a man. And in those days, men will seek death and will not find it. They will long to die, and death flees from them. So here is where things really ramp up in the things get crazy. Things not only get crazy in the fact that we are talking here about some type of hell bugs with scorpion tails, but if you look at the interpretations of the church throughout history describing and what the meaning is of the fifth trumpet, that is probably even crazier than these locusts that come up themselves. So, I mean, trying to figure out what these things mean. There are people who say that the star from heaven is Satan. Other people say the star is Jesus. Some people say the star is the gospel itself. One of the most common interpretations of Revelation 9 is that the star is the gospel, and the gospel comes to earth to expose men of their sinfulness, and if they reject the gospel, they are then tormented in their minds and bodies due to their rejection of the gospel. And so these locusts are just a spiritual result from people in every day and their rejection of the gospel. The torment pictured in these verses has been described as the persecution of Nero in the early church, to the work of Muhammad and Islam and their persecution of the church. So there are a lot of variant and radical views as to who these locusts are, what they've done, what they mean. But I'm going to take these as I have done throughout the writing of Revelation, and will continue to do so, which is I'm going to take these at face value, because I believe that's what the initial readers would have done. They would have read this and thought, you know, what John's describing is what he's saying is going to happen. So we're just going to take these at face value, and what John says occurs, we're going to say that's going to be what's going to happen. So the fifth angel blows the fifth trumpet, and when he blows, the first thing that happens is God gives a key to a star in heaven. Now, based on the usage of star throughout Revelation, that star has got to be an angel. It's got to be an angel. I don't believe it should be a demonic fallen angel, but I believe it should be an angel, as this star is not only given the key, but it's given a role of something to do by God. So God gives this angel a key. The angel takes the key and uses it to open the bottomless pit. And this is one of those places where I am just like, please, can we not just use the regular Greek word? This is not some phrase for bottomless pit. It's just the Greek word for an abyss. It comes up several other times in the New Testament. Based on Romans 10:7, I believe this abyss should be seen as the realm of the dead. The realm of the dead in the Old Testament went by the title Sheol in the Old Testament. If you see the word Hades in the New Testament, Hades should not be equivalent with the Greek idea of the underworld. It should also not be equivalent with hell, but Hades should be seen as Sheol, which is where all the dead went, along with a place where the demons were imprisoned during this time period. In Luke chapter 8, verse 31, when Jesus is confronting the man who is afflicted by the demon or demons by the name of Legion, what the Legion does is they beg Jesus not to send them to the abyss. So the abyss is the location that is unlocked here. It should be seen as part of Sheol, where the fallen angels, and if you really want to get into the weeds of Jewish theology and history, this is where the Nephilim would have been held ever since the period before the flood. So the angel goes and opens the pit, and something that was held in the pit is released from the pit. And I say something because I don't think that this is all the fallen angels are released. I don't think all the demonic forces are there that is released. But I think a very narrow and specific group out of those who are in the abyss are released. And verses 3 through 6 covers what these demonic forces do when they are released. And then verses 7 through 12 cover their appearance. So let's set the stage right for this. We have this darkened, fear-induced world as a result of the fourth trumpet. People are terrified by what is going on around them. And then the result of the fourth trumpet, the first result does not have to deal with the demons, but the first result is smoke that ascends from Sheol, from the abyss. And it appears that that smoke further darkens the world, further brings about that sense of foreboding. And here is also where we need to pause and say, remind ourselves that what we're talking about here is the spiritual realm of the dead, the spiritual realm of angels and demons coming into visible contact with the physical world. Have any of us seen anything like that happen before? We have not. Unless you believe that Ghostbusters is a documentary or The Sixth Sense was a true story about seeing dead people, we have not seen anything like this. And I think that should give us a lot of humility. It should also allow us to have some comfort sitting in the mystery where we're saying, I'm doing my best to understand what's going on here, but if I'm not overly sure what's going on, that's okay. We don't want to ignore the truth that's here. We want to glean what we can, but we need to understand that what's being described here is something that we have never seen before. So these demonic beings, they are termed as locusts. And the first thing we want to say right off the bat is these are not real locusts. How do we know they're not real locusts? Well, number one, where do they come from? They come from the abyss, the realm of the dead. Real locusts do not come up from the abyss and the realm of the dead. Even if you're a farmer who despises them, they are not real demonic forces. Number two, these locusts do not eat vegetation. Real locusts, that's what they're all about. And then the third, and I think most revealing that they're not locusts, is that they have, I think pretty clearly, a commander. So they're going to have reasoning capabilities. They're going to be able to follow commands. They're going to have someone who's going to be directing them throughout the world. So these are demonic forces that are described as being like locusts. that in the end aren't really a whole lot like locusts. And so we'll probably get into why John might be terming them as locusts. But let's talk about what their goal is. What do they attempt to do? The first thing we need to say about the goal of the locusts is what they are not going to do. And that is they will not be vegetarians. This will not be a plague that will further afflict the land, the crops, the vegetation of earth. That's important to note because what just got devastated earlier in the trumpet judgments, the land, the crops, and so forth, they will be protected from this. This will not happen to them. So this means that the fifth trumpet judgment is like the eighth plague in Egypt in the fact that they are locusts, but it's not like the eighth plague in the fact that it's not real locusts who are going and eating and laying waste to their crops. So they won't harm the crops, but the locusts are going to go after the farmers of the crops. They're going to go after the people. And specifically, it says they're going to harm anyone who is not sealed by God. And who are those that are sealed by God in the context of Revelation? Well, on the one hand, we might want to say, it's us. We got to seal the Holy Spirit in us. In the context of Revelation, it is the 144,000 Israelites who are sealed as the witnesses earlier in this book, which then leads to what to me is the most perplexing question when it comes to the trumpet judgments. And it's something that I should just leave up to God and not be concerned about myself, but this is the thought I think about the most. And that is, you're going to have all those Gentile believers during that time period. And that specifically, they're not sealed. Specifically, based on how it reads of them being in heaven, is that they suffer and die during that time period. So will the Gentile believers also be subject to the suffering of these locusts along with the rest of the world? The text is silent. It doesn't tell us, so we don't know. So I'm just going to lean on grace and say that God will be very gracious to these people, even if they do suffer in some way from it. He will protect them and give them the mercy and the grace that they need during this time period. But we read here is that the judgment that the locusts will bring upon men is that they will have stings like the sting of a scorpion. And the interesting thing reading about scorpion stings is that scorpions are not deadly. You could be stung by scorpions every day and you would not die from them. They are not deadly stings. So that really fits perfectly in line with what's being described here. The other thing is that the sting of scorpions, it has kind of a range. Some of it depends upon your own personal reaction to the scorpion. But scorpion stings say that they range in pain from moderate to severe in the world of stings and bites by animals. So they hurt. For most people, they hurt a lot. But again, this is torment and pain that is caused, but it does not cause death. And I'm going to guess that when you look at the use of the word for torment that's used here, it's going to point to the fact that the worst thing about these scorpions might not even be their sting, but it might just be the fear that they're around you, or the fear that they might sting you. Because the word that's used as torment here is a word that refers to both physical and mental anguish. Then it more often talks to more of a psychological torment. And so I think that a lot of the problem that people are going to have from these locusts is not going to come from the pain of the sting itself, but could you imagine being in a world where everything is darkened? People are dying of thirst, dying of hunger because of the crops, and then all of a sudden you have these bug-type things that are stinging people all over the place. Nobody knows what they are. We're going to talk about how horrendous they look in a moment. All around you at all time, probably because of the darkness. You never know. Is there one in your bed? You can't really see because things are kind of dark and murky, and you never know if theirs are there. It's going to be terrifying, and what goes on in your brain could be a lot worse than the sting that actually happens in your body. Well, probably the people who are living through that time period are probably going to be a lot like little children in their mental view of future pain. If there's one thing that you know, having taken kids to doctors or any type of medical issue that they have, a lot of times the fear of the shot is far worse for a little kid than the shot itself. It's like, this shot is not going to be that bad. But their fear of it's going to be the worst part of it. And I think that's what it's pointing to with these locusts, that the sting's actually not going to need to be what's terrible, but just the threat of having them around is going to be awful. And then that brings us to the time period that the fifth trumpet will last. And we read that it is 5 months of torment. And for John, this 5 months is important because it's mentioned twice in the passage. We have it in verse 10. It will be repeated as well. And this time period of 5 months actually causes a lot of problems for people who don't hold to a prophetic view of Scripture that we do, because we can put this in the future and say this is happening in the tribulation period. It'll just be 5 months, like John said. But for those people who say that this is taking place all throughout the church age, that 5 months becomes very problematic. But the 5 months actually ends up being really logical when you learn one simple fact, and that is the locust season in the ancient Near East lasts 5 months. The locust season goes from May through September every year in the period in which the Bible would be written. So it's just saying we're basically going to have a locust lake season. And I think that that's probably one of the reasons these are called locusts. Not because they're actually locusts, but I think two things are going to happen. One, there's going to be a ton of them, like locusts. They'll be everywhere. And then the length of time that they will last will be the length of a typical locust season, 5 months, which is why John ends up calling these things locusts, because when we look at their appearance now in verses 7 through 12, we're going to end up saying, I don't think these look like locusts, John. It's great that you want to picture them that way, but they do not look like them. So verses 7 through 12 say, the appearance of the locust was like, and this is where you expect them to say, the appearance of the locust was like locusts or like bugs, but he says they're like horses prepared for battle. And on their heads appeared to be crowns like gold, and their faces were like the faces of men. They had hair like the hair of women, and their teeth were like the teeth of lions. They had breastplates like breastplates of iron, and the sound of their wings was like the sound of chariots, of many horses rushing to battle. Now, could you imagine being in a darkened room and having one of those flying around you and not being sure where it was? It would just be terrifying. They have tails like scorpions and stings, and in their tail is the power to hurt men for 5 months. They have a king over them, the angel of the abyss. His name in Hebrew is Abaddon, and in the Greek has the name Apollyon. The first woe is past. Behold, 2 woes are coming after these things. So what do these locusts look like? I found some artist rendering online. So here are some ideas of what some artists had in mind when they read these. So there's one. Here's we got another option. And then finally, we got 2 options where I feel like people leaned into the horse image a little bit more. So we have various ideas of what these things could look like. But I'm going to say when it comes to imagining what these things would look like, we need to remember that the key word to the description of these locusts is the word like. The word like comes up again and again and again. It's like a horse, like crowns of gold, like men's feet, like a scorpion's tail. In other words, I'm going to guess none of these renderings are probably going to be close at all to what these creatures actually look like. Our imaginations are going to be far off to what these look like in reality. As an example of what our imaginations of what these things could look like don't align with reality is that a while back, somebody took a skull and presented it to artists who did renderings for dinosaurs. And they were like, here's this skull. I want you to give us an artist rendering of what this dinosaur would probably look like. So here's the skull, very imposing skull. They're like, what do you give us an artist rendering of what this dinosaur looked like. That's the result that they came of what that dinosaur, totally makes sense. Like, look at that. That looks great. That skull, though, is the skull of a hippopotamus. And that's what it looks like in real life. nothing like the artist rendering is what the hippopotamus look like in real life. And so that is a good, gauge for us to say that whatever we're going to speculate these things look like, we're probably not going to be close based upon the hippopotamus scale skull alone. But again, we have a repeat in these verses that they're going to hurt men for 5 months. And then we come to the other intriguing part of the locusts is that they will have a king. They will have a commander. They will have someone who will lead them into battle. And his name is Abaddon or Apollyon. And those are simply the Greek words for destroyer. So probably a better translation would be to say their name is destroyer. That's it. Like we're taking just straight up the Greek word for destroyer and we're transliterating it to get those titles. So I don't think it would be a stretch to say that they are led by destroyer, ruler of the abyss. Although no one would want to rule in the place where you are a prisoner under God's wrath. Now there's some speculation that Apollyon should be connected to the Greek god Apollo or Apollon, because the spelling is so close and so similar. But Apollo was the son of Zeus. He was seen as one of the most important Greek gods. And so to say that the leader of these demon locusts was Apollo, one of the most important Greek gods, could be seen as a way to kind of mock the Greek gods, to be like, in comparison to the Lord whom we worship, the Greek gods would be nothing but rulers and leaders over bug people. Like they are that far below the Lord. So it could be a way to remind the Christians of that time period that they don't have anything to fear or worry about when it comes to these pagan gods of the world, because in comparison to our God, they're nothing. They're nothing before him. It's like they have bugs under their command. And I think that's probably a pretty good application, that one that I could really stand behind. Because if you need to remember, they are living in a world where, all around them are temples to those gods. And they are constantly bombarded with images that these gods are real, they're powerful, you should worship them. If you're a good citizen, you're going to go to the temple of Apollo and bow down before him and sleep with his prostitutes. So I don't think it's a far-fetch that in the middle of the book of Revelation, there's this little dig to say, compared to our God, Apollo's the bug god. So don't worry about him. He's not really that important or powerful in comparison to our Lord. He's nothing but a demonic force. So we have these demonic creatures who, in their description, if we're honest, I think the one thing we need to say about their description is they're just going to be horrifying. They're going to torment the world for 5 months in pain and terror. And then the other thing to remember is that because they have a leader, they're going to inflict the world in pain and terror in a logical, methodical way. They're not just going to be mindless bugs roaming about, but they're going to afflict the world with a thinking commander. And this is going to be so terrible that when the description is finished, we're going to have a different way to describe these. It's not going to say the 5th trumpet is over, but it's going to say the first of 3 woes is finished. To me, to say the seal judgments were one thing, the first 4 trumpet judgments were something, but now that we get to the 5th trumpet judgment, this is an entirely different category. This woe is fundamentally different and more terrible and destructive than anything that we have seen before. But then that always brings us to the question of why. Why does this happen? Why these trumpet judgments? And then what would it mean for these struggling churches in the late 1st century as they were watching the apostles die off? What would this mean for them and for us? So a few things for us to remember as far as application and how this would relate to the 1st century church. The first thing to remember in the trumpet judgments is that, 1, God hears and answers prayers. So why do the judgments of the trumpets happen? Because they are the answer to the prayers of the saints. We always need to tie what happened with the throwing of that incense to the earth with all of the trumpet judgments. So this would probably mean a lot more to Christians who are under persecution today than those of us in the 21st century. Second, I believe this is a judgment on how we have treated one another, those who are made in the image of God. We have so ruined and harmed and attacked one another. We have so defamed the image of God on earth that God basically needs to ruin the earth in order to remake it. God needs to ruin the earth, sort of go back to square one before Jesus Christ can come and rule and refashion the earth in grace and mercy and compassion. So something has totally gone awry in this world. God fashioned it for his glory, but sin is corrupting it. And God's going to basically need to hit a restart here. Clear the field, so to speak, in order to bring glory to this world that we have ruined. And I think the final application of this is that we can trust in the power of God more than we can fear the forces of man. God's power is the supreme power. Jesus is going to return one day. It might not be in our lifetime. It wasn't in the lifetime of those who first read this letter, but one day Jesus is going to come back. And when Jesus comes back, he is going to afflict judgment upon this world that no one will be able to withstand. And no one will be able to say that God does not rule in power and in glory and in judgment. And next week, we're going to pick up on the 6 trumpet judgments and then follow that with the forgotten judgments in Revelation chapter 10.